Hello, and welcome to the Atlantic Debrief, the Atlantic Council Europe Center's internet show and podcast on the most pressing issues impacting the transatlantic relationship today. This is part of the Europe Center's Transatlantic Horizon series, which seeks to outline a productive relationship for the United States and Europe for 2025 and beyond. My name is Rachel Rizzo, and I'm a non-resident senior fellow here at the Atlantic Council's Europe Center. And my guest today is Dave Keating, who's the Brussels correspondent for France 24 and non-resident senior fellow here at the Europe Center. Dave, welcome to the show.
Hi, Rachel. Great to be with you.
So let's jump right into it. European leaders met for the latest EU summit to discuss the multi-annual financial framework and future support for Ukraine. Chief among these announcements was this long-awaited 50 billion euro package for Ukraine. Here in the United States, there's this $60 billion aid package for Ukraine in Congress, still hanging in the balance. So there's a lot of stuff to unpack. I want to jump right in and discuss the outcomes of the summit and maybe what's next for Ukraine. So with this 50 billion euro Ukraine funding package sorted, walk us through how this deal was carried over the finish line. How did the EU convince Hungary's Viktor Orban to get on board? He's been threatening to tank the deal for a while now. And what are the next steps here?
Yeah, the short answer is we don't know. It's a bit of a mystery. There's a couple different theories about what might have gotten Viktor Orban over the line here. I think the most important thing to know at the outset is that this was not a regularly scheduled summit. This summit was not supposed to happen. This summit was called because the EU leaders failed to convince Orban to release his veto in December. This vote was supposed to take place at the regular December council. And while Orban was convinced to drop his veto on starting accession negotiations with Ukraine, they did not convince him to drop his veto on the funding. And so this extra session had to be called. Now, what happened in the month and a half in between? Two things. One, they were working to convince Hungary or trying to find out from Orban and from the Hungarian government what they would need in order to drop that veto. And at the same time, they were building this other track, this Plan B, in which they would fund Ukraine as 26 out of the 27 EU countries. They would basically take it out of the EU budget and launch this separate new thing, almost necessitating new institutions. That was going to be really complicated. It would have needed approval by the parliament. That was really undesirable. They didn't want to do that. So their best hope here was to convince Orban to release that veto. And strangely, only about 5 minutes after the summit officially began, we got the announcement that Hungary was dropping its veto. It was a big surprise. And kind of strange when you think about it, because the summit had one purpose only, and it was that. So when you accomplish that in the first 5 minutes, what's left to do? They actually only met for 3 hours in the end. That's extremely short for a European Council summit. Basically, what happened was in the morning, Orban met with Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni, German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, and French President Emmanuel Macron. And some deal was made there, or something that got Orban to change his mind. And we have all kinds of different accounts from that. I think some more credulous accounts are saying it was simply a charm offensive by Macron or by Meloni, and they got along so well that Orban decided to drop his veto. I don't think that's very probable. Now, the Hungarians can point to two things that were changed in the text. One is that they're going to have this annual review of the funding for Ukraine. The Commission will come with a report each year on its implementation. But Hungary didn't get what it was asking for, which was an ability to veto their aid every year. They wanted an annual review that would require a unanimous vote to continue the funding. They didn't get that. They got this report from the Commission every year, and after 2 years, if all 27 EU countries request it, they can get a renegotiation or a proposed renegotiation from the Commission. That's not going to happen. So they didn't get what they wanted, and really nobody was objecting to the idea of having an annual review. I don't know why anyone would object to that. The other thing they're pointing to that was changed was they got a reference in the conclusions to the original language from a December 2020 summit when they were talking about the Article 7 procedure. That is the procedure that the European Parliament has called to be used against Hungary for violations of rule of law. It basically says if an EU member state government is violating the rule of law, that they can lose their voting rights in the council. So Hungary is saying now it's clear that the procedure can't be used against us simply because we oppose aid to Ukraine. It can't be abused. The issue with that is that it wasn't going to be used. If they had used it, there was increasing talk that if Orban maintained his veto at this summit, they would start talking about Article 7. But obviously, if they had triggered it, they would not have said, the reason we're doing this is because you're blocking Ukraine funding. They would have triggered it on the basis of Hungary's rule of law violations, which have already been well documented by the Commission and has already caused them to lose funding. So referring to that original language that says it's about rule of law doesn't really change anything. There's some people that are wondering if there's more to that sentence, if there was a verbal agreement within the council behind closed doors that Orban got some assurance that they'll never use Article 7 against him in exchange for this. But all the leaders were very insistent. They gave nothing to Hungary, and he dropped his veto. The other reason that they may have dropped the veto is that on Monday we got this explosive bombshell report from the Financial Times about a leaked internal document from the council that was analyzing Hungary's economy and looking at the best way to sabotage the economy, essentially by withholding EU funds, what would be most painful for Hungary. That caused the Hungarian currency to drop, and it may be that threat was enough to spook Orban's government into relenting. At this time, we just don't know. Maybe it will become clearer over time, but I'm seeing, in terms of news reports, you're getting every explanation manageable. So right now, I don't really know who to believe.
So if the charm offensive theory is the right one, which it probably isn't, there's a lot more to it. Does this highlight the ability for powerful leaders within the EU to put pressure on certain other leaders to get things done? I'm thinking, you opened your comments by talking about the meeting that EU leaders and Orban had with Scholz and Macron and Meloni in the morning. Does this show that pressure campaigns can actually work if done in the right way?
That's my suspicion about what happened here. There was a report in the Italian newspaper Corriere della Sera, which said that one of the people in that room, they didn't say who, basically laid into Orban and said, we're going to destroy you if you continue this veto. That doesn't match other accounts of what happened in that room. So again, who knows? It's kind of speculation. But a lot of people were making the joke after all of this went down, the old expression, the troika always wins. And what they meant by that was during the European debt crisis, whenever leaders, let's say Alexis Tsipras from Greece, from the left-wing party Syriza, when they would threaten to do something, in the end, the economic incentives made what they were threatening to do impossible. That when they were faced with the economic might of the European Union, they had to relent. And so people were making that comparison after this, that it may be that leaked document that spooked Orban, and maybe a dressing down by one of those leaders in that room. It's very hard to tell. I think the fact that that was a report in an Italian newspaper suggests it actually might have been Meloni who did that. That would be very interesting because she is the closest to Orban of anyone in that room. She's also from the far right. And it would be very interesting if it was her that actually convinced him, not through a charm offensive, but through threats.
Yeah, that's what's so interesting about Meloni's prime ministership is that everyone, especially here in the United States, was sort of freaking out about this far-right leader in many people's minds being elected to lead Italy. And she's actually been very forward-leaning on Ukraine, which I think has been a welcome surprise for many people, both in Europe and the United States. Swedish Prime Minister Ulf Kristersson, who was quoted saying that this decision at the EU summit not only sends a strong signal to Ukraine, but it also sends a strong signal to the U.S. As everyone knows, the U.S. Congress is locked and unable to come to an agreement on future support for Ukraine, specifically the $60 billion aid package, because they're unable to come to a deal on stricter southern border controls. Do you think this sends a message to the U.S., especially to Europe detractors in the U.S., that the EU can actually get things done. So maybe hold up a mirror to yourselves and try to come to some sort of agreement. I'm not sure what that message would send, but I'm just curious if you see sort of a connection there.
Yeah, I think it certainly did. And President Macron made the same point in his closing press conference. He said something along the lines of Europe has taken its responsibility, and that's the message to Washington. I think this takes the wind out of the sails of those in the U.S., Trump following Republicans, who have said, look, this is Europe's responsibility and Europe isn't even doing anything. They don't spend money on their military, kind of parroting lines from Trump. And so why should we be bailing out Europe when this is their job? So I think the argument now is this is a fairly similar amount of money to what the U.S. is considering. More, actually. So this is the EU saying, we're putting our money on the line here. And it does deflect that argument. Now, is it going to make the difference to convince those Republicans to drop their veto on the U.S. funding? I don't think so. I think it might help, but we know that there's a lot of domestic political calculations involved in that that are not necessarily about, policy, beliefs, or ideology. So we'll see. Maybe this could get them over the line in the U.S. It certainly doesn't hurt. I'm sure the Biden administration is very happy that this went through as 27 without a signal of division that doing it as 26 would have implied. And President Biden did give a call to President von der Leyen the night after that summit, congratulating her on getting that funding through.
So finally, I'm wondering if this major decision could have ripple effects through other issues within the European Union, specifically on bolstering defense projects. So we're seeing a growing focus of EU and member state leaders on the need for deeper integration, more European efforts in terms of bolstering their own defense, calling for an increase of European capabilities, which for EU watchers, especially in the United States, have been calling for this for a while. Do you think that this could signal a potential change in political will in the EU to take some efforts at bolstering defense projects more seriously than perhaps they've taken them in the past?
I don't think this will make a difference to that. Unfortunately, there are lots of problems in that area. Europe hasn't even delivered half of the ammunition that they said they were going to deliver to Ukraine. There are problems with the European Peace Facility, which is a different negotiation track than this one. This was about budget aid to Ukraine. The military aid to Ukraine comes from the European Peace Facility. That has all kinds of complications. I think, if anything, what's going to motivate European leaders to start taking defense more seriously again will be the prospect of Donald Trump being elected in the United States and possibly pulling the U.S. out of NATO, or at least showing disinterest in NATO. We saw this big rush after Russia's invasion in 2022. We saw the EU cross red lines it had never crossed before in terms of defense, in terms of moving toward a defense union. But I've seen that energy really sputter over the past year. So we got a lot of unprecedented moves into EU defense, something that was always a anathema for several countries, one of them no longer in the EU, the UK. But then it kind of petered out. It kind of petered out in the course of 2023, and you're not hearing a lot of big messages around this anymore. You're not hearing a lot of talk. Now, as we get closer to November, that may spook Europeans into picking up this theme again. But I think that is not necessarily about Ukraine. I think that a lot of people are thinking that that's just about delivering aid to Ukraine. But I think it's also about general security. I mean, if the U.S. is no longer there to protect Europe, that has huge security implications for Europe that don't just involve Ukraine, don't even just involve Russia. So I think we're going to see a move in that direction, but it's not necessarily about Ukraine or Russia. It's about the United States.
Okay. And then I actually do have one more question, because you mentioned it, the European Peace Facility. What's the future of that? I mean, Germany doesn't want to continue to support this off-budget funding mechanism. It basically incentivizes EU member states to provide military equipment to Ukraine and then reimburses them for some of the costs. What's the future of the European Peace Facility? Do you have any insight into that?
Yeah, I think that's another example of how the energy here is sputtering, because the European Peace Facility was such a huge departure from EU orthodoxy before then. You had at the beginning the countries with constitutionally guaranteed neutrality, so Ireland and Austria having exemptions so that their funding to that peace facility would only be used for non-lethal aid. You're getting more and more countries interested in that. Now Hungary, Slovakia, now Germany is having issues. So we're seeing a lot of people back away from this thing now. I don't know what the future holds for the European Peace Facility. I think that, again, if it can be connected to this, Trump prospect issue, that it could convince some people in Berlin in particular that, no, this is a really important fund and need to stand by it and not be so obsessed with what you did nationally and what's being reimbursed, that the principle of this is actually the most important thing. But certainly it is sputtering, it is in trouble, and we'll see. Maybe the summit agreement can convince people, hey, we got an agreement on this, let's focus minds, let's really make sure this thing is working. But it's been tough. I think the panic that was first prompted by Russia's invasion has given way to a kind of acceptance of the situation, and it's going to take something else to, the people say the EU only takes major action when it feels under threat, and I think that threat at this point is coming from Washington.
Well, not the happiest note to end on, but glad that the EU is able to get this across the finish line. It's a huge accomplishment. Hopefully the US follows suit. Dave, thanks so much for taking time out of your schedule to chat with us. This was super informative. And it's going to be a great addition to all of the conversations that are happening around this EU summit. Thanks for your time.
Thanks. Great to be here.